In the past couple of videos then, we've been looking at the principles of animation, and specifically in the last one, we saw, of course, the principles that are based on general motion dynamics. Little things that we insert into a motion to make it more realistic, more believable, more natural. What I want to come down to in this video is the idea of forces. Forces, at least I find, give a great way to think about what's going on inside of an animation, but also to give you cues and clues as to what needs to happen or needs to happen next. Certainly when you're working your way through an animation, it can be a lot of work, and trying to think of all of the little different, in-between poses and transitions, and should this arm move that way, and should I flex the hand like this or like that? It can be a lot to dig out of your imagination. This is one of the reasons that we have the principles of animation, and it sort of gives us a playbook to start working from. But the principles themselves are the result and the consequence of physical forces, nothing more. For instance, let us take the overlap example, overlapping action like this. Why does it happen? Well, quite simply, it happens because we presume that these two items here are physical objects with weight. This first one here is swinging for whatever reason. Maybe it's just, being let flop by itself in a passive manner. Maybe it's got a motor driving it. It doesn't really matter. What matters, of course, is what's happening on the overlapper, the second item. It's just sort of hanging there on the edge, at the base of the other item. Of course, the reason that it overlaps is that when the top item starts to change direction, it still has momentum. It still has a movement force trying to push it that way. The reason, of course, is because that is the direction in which it was already travelling. Even though its parent item starts to swing back, that momentum can't just disappear instantaneously. It has to slow out. Thus, you get this element of drag, you get this overlap, and this is why you get this overlapping action. Obviously, I say there, slow out. If we look at the top item and we look at its actual rotation, then we can see quite clearly what I've got going on here. I've got this slow in, slow out action going on from this spline here. The speed at which it is rotating is constantly changing as it goes from rotating in one direction to rotating in the other. It doesn't, as we would have in a linear situation, simply change direction instantaneously. Rather, it has to slow down first, effectively at the point of the keyframe come to a stop, and then begin swinging back in the other direction, gradually building acceleration as it does so. In a formal manner, forces can be represented very simply. We represent them with vectors. If you're not familiar, you're free to go and look at the vectors video in the nodal section on my YouTube channel. However, to be honest, there's no real need for this, as a lot of the specific details aren't important. What matters is that whenever a force is acting on something, it is always acting in a given direction, and so we can represent it with a little arrow here. What the force will also have is a level of strength. How do we represent that? Well, simply, we represent that by the length of the arrow. Thus, a force acting in the same direction but with twice the amount of energy would just be an arrow pointing the same way, but twice as long. Why is this interesting? Well, let us imagine that we've got a ball, right? And it is moving along in this direction with this much force being applied to it. Then somehow another force gets applied to it, acting in this direction with this much strength. What direction will the ball go in? Well, nothing has cancelled out this force here. Rather, we have added a new force in a different direction. Force vectors are easily added together. You basically just take the first vector arrow like this, and at its tip draw the tail of the second vector arrow like this, and the new vector then is this distance or arrow between them. just like that, the tail of one to the tip of the second. As such, our ball, which was moving this way, after the application of that second force, will now be moving over in this direction with that much force or speed or what have you. This is why our little bone example works the way it does. First of all, here is our bone and it's, posed up like this. It's pivoting from here and gravity is trying to pull it down. Thus, it swings down some, but because it has weight, because it has mass, it overswings ever so slightly, coming to a new position over here, at which point gravity is still pulling down on it, it gets swung back, and so on. Consequently, we get this sort of action going on for our top item, where it slows down at the two extremes. Clearly, in this example, it would have to be being driven by a motor rather than just swinging under the effects of gravity, as if it were just swinging freely, then the swing would decrease with each new swing. It would get lesser and lesser. It would decay. Why? Because those different gravity arrows would be constantly stacking up on top of one another, pulling it ever straighter and straighter and straighter until it stopped. In the case of the old ball getting pushed as it, comes along and then winds up taking off in a new direction like this, we can of course see the result of viewing the forces this way right here in our graph editor. Notice our x position that we have keyed here is completely linear. The x position isn't changing its rate or changing its direction or anything like that. It's not moving any less on the x just because it starts moving on the z. Reason why? Because we don't have a force hitting it from the opposite side of the x. And this, of course, for just an item in motion like this, starts to show us why we get arcs of motion. We see the dragon who's flying along and takes this arc as he comes around the corner there. He can't stop and change direction instantly. Rather, he's coming along here in x. He uses his wings to push against the air, which gives him a bit of a nudge towards z. Thus his direction of travel becomes this combination across x and z there. And he keeps his wings up, continuing to push against himself and bringing himself round. As the different forces acting on him add up and push against one another, it changes his direction over time, causing this arced motion. Whilst we are talking about these arcs that form in the motion paths of things that are flying around through space, one thing that's important for us to, take a quick note of is centre of gravity, or possibly more correctly, centre of mass. Obviously, every object that we're animating has weight, it has mass, but this mass isn't all concentrated at one point in the object, it's distributed across the object's entire body. Thus, the centre of mass for an item is basically just the average centre of all of this mass. Commonly, of course, here in 3D, we treat this as the item's pivot point. And certainly putting pivot points on things, whether, just the models or in rigs or what have you, at the location of the centre of mass is always a good idea, as it helps you to get a bit more natural animation just straight off the bat without having to do anything. Imagine if the pivot point of this ball, for instance, were at, the top edge or the bottom. Then when it's falling through space and spinning around, we'd constantly be having to animate it up and down to try and keep its actual centre of mass, in this case it's, dead centre, falling along the fixed path. Of course, there's two important things to note about centre of mass. First of all, that it is always within the object's bounding volume. It can never be outside of it, that's impossible. And secondly, that its location has to do with the distribution of mass within the three-dimensional shape of that object. So, of course, with our ball here, we just imagine it to, be a homogeneous ball made of stone or clay or whatever else. Its centre of mass is, of course, dead centre. It is at its geometric centre. However, if we have some sort of object like this, where there's, a rod protruding out one side of it, then clearly the distribution of mass across the entire shape is slightly different. As such, the centre of mass would not be at the centre of the ball here, it would be slightly displaced further up towards the rod. Though of course that depends on, the materials that are making this thing up. If this rod here is a lead rod, whilst the ball is just some hollow shell of paper mache, then the vast majority of the object's weight and its mass is, contained within the rod, and as such its centre of mass or centre of gravity would be up in the rod somewhere, since there is very little mass distributed down in the paper mache ball. Some things might be a little bit weird, like for instance, a tortoise or a donut. Here it is, it's nice and perfectly symmetrical and everything else. However, its centre of mass, its centre of gravity, and therefore the pivot point that would sketch out its motion path, is outside of its actual physical bounds, because of course it occurs here at the hole. All of the mass is evenly distributed around this central point. It is, however, of course, notice, within the bounding volume of the object still. This idea has another level of importance, of course, when it comes to characters. I've seen it expressed many times that the root item here, generally the character's hips, is taken as their centre of gravity. This is plainly wrong. The hips on a biped are often their centre of motion, in terms of that's where they drive themselves from, that's often where they lead from, but it's most certainly not their centre of gravity. For instance, just take a narrow stool, try and sit on it with your pelvis over it and lay out completely horizontal, you'll tip back overwards onto your head. The weight of your, butt, legs and feet is less than the combined weight of your torso, arms and head. You certainly can't just be balanced, on a pivot in a seesaw manner at the point of your hip. The centre of mass, centre of gravity for something like this, a standard bipedal character, will be somewhere in the upper belly, lower chest sort of region. However, the one thing with characters, of course, is the fact that they have no fixed centre of mass. It moves. Why? Well, quite simply because a character can displace their shape. They can push themselves around and redistribute their mass into a new form. Thus, when they do this, obviously, the centre of gravity moves around. Take a pose like this, and the centre of gravity has shifted itself off here, over to the character's left-hand side. The fact that reposable or reshapeable bodies like this have a shifting centre of gravity also does a lot to influence certain details of animation itself. For instance, you imagine, walking along a narrow ledge or a tightrope or some such. If you do it in this manner, with your arms tucked in tight, then the overall body, the overall silhouette, is exceedingly narrow. As such, whilst performing the walk, tiny little shifts to the left and right, just like this, will be pushing the centre of gravity to the left and right to quite a degree. However, if you take your arms and you stick them out for balance like this, what happens is you distribute your mass somewhat over a wider area of space. And so while shifting left to right will still cause your centre of gravity to shift, it will be shifting less relative to the amount of space that your body is occupying. That way your centre of gravity remains, more closely centred over the top of where your feet are contacting, and thus you stay on balance better. Another very useful thing to be aware of in this whole situation of how it is that, forces add up and work on top of one another is a little property that you can think of as a certain symmetry inside of forces. This is most common in situations, here on Earth or perhaps some other planet in some wonderful sci-fi series, where you actually have a kind of gravitational field constantly pulling down on things. Here is the nice Earth, and we take an object here and we fire it up into the air. We do this with a certain amount of force. Of course, the entire time, both whilst the object is initially on the ground and at every point during its flight, it is being pulled down by the force of gravity. These two forces cancel out one another, thus obviously it comes back down to Earth again. But the point worthy of note is the fact that the size of the force that pushed it up is always equal to the size of the force that pulled it back down again. These two forces, the sizes of these two forces, the amount of energy captured or released in each of these movements is equal. And this starts to explain other things that we will commonly see in animation. Like this guy here, doing a little jump. What does he do? Well, he anticipates his jump by crouching down. Why? Well, because he has leg muscles. He isn't a passive thing like our swinging bones or our ball just getting knocked about. He is an active system. The forces that are pushing him are coming from within his own muscles. He's not relying just on external forces to push him around through space. He is generating his own internal forces actively. Thus, he crouches down to store up energy in his leg muscles, which he then pushes out to spring, overcoming the force of gravity. Thus, the force with which he's pushing himself up at this point is greater than the amount of force pulling him down. That's how come he leaves the ground. But at some point, those forces cancel one another out, and he comes back down with the exact same amount of force, causing a follow-through action whereby he has to crouch again. The interesting point of note here is the symmetry. One thing that you might find, if you go ahead and you try animating a jump on a character like this, you can sort of get to the stage, especially if you've been looking at it for a little while, where you start to lose sight of what's going on, and you sort of look at it and you think to yourself, okay, does this look right? I mean, he's jumping up and then he's falling down. Does it all look nice? Does it look balanced? Does it look natural and realistic? Well, of course, the amount of force pushing him up must be equal to that pulling him down. And since the distance up and the distance down are the same, then the whole movement should be symmetrical. Consequently, one great way to diagnose an awful lot of animation to get a sense of how naturally it's playing is to play it backwards. And as we see here playing our jump, it looks pretty much the same, forwards or backwards, little difference. Why? All the forces acting on the character are symmetrical, and therefore they will be time symmetrical as well. Clearly there are little differences, like what he's doing with his arms. Played forwards, he's pushing his arms down to try and give himself that extra little burst, and of course when he falls down they drag and trail behind a bit, creating this overlapping action. But aside from that, the rate at which his body is actually moving, and indeed the amount that he comes down by in his crouch, is equal on both sides of the jump here. So there we have it. This is really why some of the principles of animation exist. They are simply there to remind us to include the laws of physics in our animation, because by doing so, our animations will more closely reflect the reality that the viewers are used to seeing in their everyday lives, and thus will appear more natural and more believable. And thinking in terms of these principles, and of course the forces that cause them to happen, help to give us cues when animating about what motions to take, how far to push things, and even, as we saw with the little ball there, how our graphs might need to look. All of these things will aid us in the business of putting together animation, and throughout this tutorial series, once we get into actually doing some animation, we'll talk about such things as we're going along at the different stages quite a lot. Something else to be aware of about forces is, of course, that they propagate through things. Of course, take the example of the good old Newton's cradle. What you have when a ball strikes, one side of the stack of balls is that it can't penetrate the next ball, but it still has force, it still has momentum, it still has energy, and that energy must go somewhere. Where it travels, of course, is in the same direction, along the same vector that it was already travelling in. Hence, it pushes the entire stack of balls a bit, less, of course, than the first ball was moving, because the weight of the first ball is smaller than the combined weight of all the other balls. But since this ball on the end has no block on its outside edge to stop it moving, as this force propagates down the chain and hits this last ball, that causes it to be popped out as well. This is why a Newton's cradle works the way that it works. The mass or weight of items is also very important when thinking about the forces that are acting on them. If you have a character with a great big fat heavy head like this, then you can bet that that's going to be putting extra strain on his body. Thus, forces that are driving the overlap or the follow-through of actions going on in his hips and his spine will need to be exaggerated to give a sense of that weight. The mass of something is effectively a multiplier on top of the forces that it has, or its resistance to forces. This is why big, heavy objects require a lot more force to get them to move and accelerate, and also, of course, why they require a lot more counterforce to slow them down and bring them to a halt. The final thing to remember about the idea of using forces and trying to incorporate this notion of things being acted on by physical laws is the idea that they aren't some set of values that are set in stone. It's not like when producing an animation you have to go and, figure and calculate out exactly what all these things need to be at any given frame or over any given time period. Generally, when animating, you eyeball this stuff. But of course, you always remember to leave enough leeway to allow for those first principles that we spoke about: staging, appeal, exaggeration. For instance, consider cartoon animation. What do the laws of physics look like in Toontown? Well, the simple fact is that they look much like they do in our world, only perhaps a little bit different. For instance, in Toontown, gravity always applies to you. The thing is, often it doesn't apply to you until you realise that it should apply to you. Then you're screwed.